Okay, so my personal history is a lot here in East Tennessee. I graduated from the University of Tennessee with an undergrad degree in zoology and took a job out at Oak Ridge National Laboratory doing risk assessments, initially human health and then ecological for a lot of the legacy waste issues that are out there post World War II and post Cold War. And learned a lot about the risk, didn't know anything going into it, but learned a lot about the risk assessment process out there. Worked for the university as well, doing assessments. Actually did a lot of consulting for local companies doing ecological and human health risk assessments locally. So thought I had a reasonable idea of sort of how ecological risk assessment worked. And then I went to the agency, took a postdoc, and I got hired permanently about 5 years ago. And those risk assessments I were doing were sort of Superfund, RCRA, CERCLA-based assessments for contaminated sites. And when I went to Athens, Georgia, working for the research and development office there, I was doing more work for FIFRA, supporting the registration of pesticides or ecological models. And so I was really quite surprised to find that when I got there, I didn't know anything about the models that they used. I thought I was in the know, but there's all these models I'd never heard of. The process was different. Instead of having people out there doing the assessments, it was actually the EPA personnel that were doing the actual assessments and creating the models and running the models and producing the reports. So it was kind of inverted a lot. So I've been asked to provide my perspective on the practice of ecological risk in the agency, and I'd say based upon my sample size too, that it varies a lot. All right, it varies across different laws and different offices, and it varies across all these things that are important when we sort of define and set up an ecological risk assessment. The endpoints themselves, how we select species, how many species to select, the methods that are used, including tox types of issues, the actual models that are used. I ran into all these models I'd never heard of when I came to the EPA that were just sort of basic ecological risk assessment models for pesticide risk. The decision thresholds are a lot of times very much dependent upon the actual law or the actual office that is implementing the assessment. And of course, the data submittal requirements was vary widely over these different implementations. Within these different combinations of offices and laws, over time, since the 70s and 80s, 90s, over time, you've seen sort of more complexity in general. You see more models coming on, more emphasis on mechanistic types of approaches, that sort of thing. And I think recently you've seen an acceleration in sort of the use of models and development of certain models within these areas. But in order to sort of understand why this variability exists, I think you have to have some appreciation of how the EPA was formed. When I went to the EPA, I understood that it was formed under Nixon back in 1970. If you see Ruckel's house here, you can see this poor guy has no idea what he's getting himself into. But what I didn't appreciate was the fact that the EPA sort of rolled up a ton of other federal agencies, all with their own sort of responsibilities. And so a lot of the research scientists in the early 1970s of the EPA were actually coming straight over from the USDA, that essentially the EPA and sort of this office structure was sort of inherited from a number of other different agencies. And so maybe this explains a little bit why Richard Nixon would ever sign a thing, the fact that he could take 10 different agencies and reduce them down to one. But that within these different offices that are subject to different laws and have different applications of ecological risk assessment, that a lot of it goes back to even before the formation of the EPA. So we look at these specific laws, which to some level or another do require an ecological risk assessment. We see a lot of variability in their implementation. And so I'm just going to try to provide a general overview. I'll get into some specifics with FIFRA, where I've worked for the past few years in terms of the models at the end. But I just want to try to paint a broad brush of the types of assessments that occur at the agency, and to a certain extent, why it varies so much within these bins that are laws and within the different offices. So the language of these different laws really matter. In some cases, of course, it The EPA was formed in 1970, and what you see is a sort of a, you see these dates here. There's a big push of different types of regulations through Congress, from the NEPA, which came out when the EPA was formed, the Clean Air Act. FIFRA actually dated back to 1910 with some of the earliest laws, but it was redone in 1972. Clean Water Act. Essentially, you have a 10-year period where you have a lot of regulations being pushed out all at once. And for the most part, the laws itself are pretty static since then. You see occasional updates, but the sort of willingness of Congress to push through now environmental laws, of course, is much lower than it used to be back in the 1970s. And so the language of these laws and these that were passed really matter. So it's sort of a big founder effect to how ecological risk assessment is conducted within these different agencies. They're both a driver for certain types of ecological risk assessments, and they also provide some heavy constraints on the type of information, for example, that gets submitted when an assessment is going to be conducted. So I just wanted to roll through a couple of examples to sort of illustrate some of the variability that there is in these different goals and in these different endpoints. TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, is one. And the idea is sort of to protect the environment from an unreasonable risk of injury. And so you can see protection goals, which are essentially something like you're only allowed to exceed a concentration of concern 20 times a year, right? Not like some bright line, but just sort of, okay, we'll give you 20 passes on some certain threshold. And the assessment endpoints might be what we typically expect in an ecological risk assessment. NEPA, Clean Water Act, might be more habitat preservation, forest community structure, species composition, that sort of thing. CERCLA, this is the kind of stuff I was doing when I was here at Tennessee. We developed software to do risk assessment libraries for both human health and eco with Robert and Chris there in the back. These were sort of, I think, an important influence on a lot of other ecological risk assessment methods that are throughout the agency. It was heavily influenced by this for reasons I'll talk about shortly. But here we sort of have this hazard and risk-based approach that focuses on an individual, the assessments at that individual level, not an individual-based model, but just assessing a single individual sort of to hit that toxicity testing target. And then, of course, FIFRA, which is the kind of stuff I do now. And here is the goal is something like not to have regularly repeated bird kills, right? We can have some, but not too many. So the assessment endpoint is bird survival. And this, of course, clashes with something like the Endangered Species Act, which cares about individuals within a population of endangered species. And so that's sort of an interesting mix that happens nowadays is when these laws actually cross. And the mega suit that occurred was sort of a big issue in the courts in terms of which interpretation of risk was going to prevail. FIFRA versus Endangered Species Act, still an ongoing issue. And EPA is not responsible for that, sort of a contributing participant in that whole process. But the point is that ecological risk assessment in EPA, the practice is variable across these different laws, across these different offices, a lot of times back to the specific language that's in the laws, as well as to a certain extent the cultures that have evolved within the different offices that implement those laws. And of course, the big challenge now is sort of how to deal with household products and pharmaceuticals. Not a lot of ecological risk assessment is done. These are sort of high throughput types of issues. So a lot of times it's a literature review that can be done to sort of identify if there's a potential risk or not. And so even out of, there cannot be a significant modeling that occurs for a lot of these types of products under TSCA. So the result is a range of different predictive model applications across the agency, an interest in high throughput methods, especially for TSCA. Adverse outcome pathways are of big interest to a lot of people in the agency because of its ability to sort of take many chemicals and reduce it to few and to find sort of common modes of action across many chemicals. Hazard risk screening, of course, as a sort of default method that occurred early on in the 80s and into the 90s with CERCLA types of assessments. In certain situations, you see structured population modeling when when you can sort of narrow down the list of species and a list of chemicals to a level where you can support that type of assessment. This, of course, happens a lot with, or increasingly more with Endangered Species Act types of applications. Some individual-based approaches, and this general issue of uncertainty and sensitivity analysis versus bright lines, you know, that in a regulatory context, a lot of times you like to just draw a bright line and not argue about all the uncertainties, just to have a standard that gets implemented. And of course, sometimes it's a very simple literature review that forms the basis for an ecological risk assessment. So how does the practice itself change within the agency? Of course, the laws aren't changing much at the moment. There's some consideration for revising TSCA. It may or may not happen. But essentially, the practice changes slowly and carefully. Within FIFRA, for example, there needs to be sort of an external peer review of any models that are going to be used by the agency to evaluate the risk of pesticides. So that can be a long, drawn-out process. I never would have thought before I came to the agency that you know, I'd be interested in the agency being sued or anything, but I don't mind it sometimes. Turns out a lot of our research funding comes from when the EPA gets sued. But the lawsuits themselves can sort of be instigators of change. And the external review types of process, like we see the recent NAS report on population modeling, can also sort of accelerate change to a certain extent. And so the practice can change. There is kind of a nice opportunity now I think, with the on both sides, on both of the breakout groups that have been set up in terms of going to populations and going to molecular levels to change the practice in specific ways. But one of the issues, of course, and it's been touched on earlier, is that scale, different types of scales, can be a barrier to change, can be a barrier to going to the more complex mechanistic type of modeling that scientists might like. At the site-specific level, like CERCLA, RECRA, you know, those are often small contaminated sites. You can do a decent job of characterizing the exposure. You can sort of narrow down the risks of, narrow down the target species, so you can get to a level where you can sort of implement more detailed methods. On the national scale, it's tough. I mean, if you think about spatial scaling when you're talking about TSCA or FIFRA, these national scale types of assessments, you are essentially scaling across ecosystems as you increase in space. And all that implies in terms of different processes, different species that can be subject to exposure and effects. And so spatial scaling at the national level is a big challenge. Temporal, of course, can be challenging in a lot of different instances in terms of incorporating the temporal dynamics of fate and transport processes, for example, finding the data that drives that, even being able to predict well future conditions that would influence those types of dynamics. Biological scale, I'll touch on in a second, but really a lot of times for FIFRA and TSCA, for ECO, you touched on the many-to-many issue in terms of many species being exposed and ecological risk. At the same time, you can easily have thousands of chemicals that you're dealing with too, and you don't want to deal with the combinatorics of that, of chemicals times species, in terms of doing all those potential assessments. And that was what's been on the table with the endangered species megasuit, to sort of take all the registered pesticides and evaluate those against all of the known endangered species that are in the U.S. That becomes a lot of work, for lack of another approach. But these mechanistic approaches are gaining ground. Especially for those problem statements that are able to isolate, reduce the scale in ways that you can sort of get and successfully parameterize a lot of these combinations. And of course, when you aren't able to reduce those scales, then you're dealing with this trade-off of all this. How do you parameterize everything? You have emergent properties as you move up and even down, certain scales that you didn't have to deal with, say at the individual level scale, at the tox testing level scale. And at the same time, we have to reduce complexity when we want to model something, so that often is a trade-off, a tension. And as you try to reach across these different levels of biological scale, it becomes a real computational problem that people working in AOPs, people working at the tox level, people working at population models, they may be using different technologies on different types of programming languages. It can be hard to glue them together. And so implementation and defensible parameterization can be a casualty as you climb specific scales that are relevant to ecological risk assessment. Now, I don't mean defensible parameterization like publishing a paper. I mean defensible parameterization like getting it through the system and having something that's defendable when you get sued by one side or the other at the end of an assessment. So these combinatorics are a problem. These scale issues are notorious for sort of limiting some of the more mechanistic applications, the more interesting applications in some sense for some of these larger scale types of issues. So I teach, I'm an adjunct at a local university, teach freshman biology. So this may be a figure you may or may not remember from Campbell biology, which kind of shows biological scale, starting at the molecular level. And this is sort of how the course is organized. You go through cells, organelles, organ systems, through the organism level, up through populations, communities, and ecosystems. And so, during a freshman biology sequence, you start at the molecular level and move on all the way up through to ecosystems. And so it's a useful way to, and it's how this entire workshop is broken out, to sort of think about this biological scale and where you may push for improvements in certain risk assessment methods at the EPA or anywhere. The mission of the EPA is to protect human health and the environment, in that order, essentially. And so a lot of the focus, as was pointed out earlier, is on individual humans. If you look at sort of the early guidance documents for risk assessment that came out from the EPA that were very influential, the first ones are what's known as RAGs, Risk Assessment Guidance for Superfund, which sort of lays out all the exposure pathways, default parameters, et cetera, that are important for evaluating human risk to an individual, right? We care about probability of cancer or some hazard level to an individual. The Ecological Risk Assessment Framework came out a couple years later, finally finalized as this Ecological Risk Assessment Guidance for Superfund, maybe 7-8 years later, ERAGs. And what you'll notice is sort of a big increase in our graphic design capability as we get the waves on the bottom of the cover page. But overall, it's sort of a similar type of implementation, that the risks are, the assessments are focused on similar pathways, similar parameterization pathways, sort of assessing risk to individual ecological receptors so they can be tied or compared to results of tox tests. And that's kind of where a lot of the assessments have been at the EPA. And if you look at how the breakup groups are summarized, really the idea is, if you're an ecologist, you want to push from this organism type level and climb the biological scale to populations, communities, and ecosystems, and get into these types of parameterization of more complex models where you can sort of reduce the dimension of the problem enough to be able to parameterize all these components of, say, a population model. And if you're more on the biology side, you're looking to go from this organism level and dive into what's going on to get at adverse outcome pathways, to get at the various omics levels, metabolomics, proteomics, genomics, all those types of issues to sort of find the commonalities and exposure and effects that are occurring across multiple species and multiple chemicals within a given class. And in that case, you're sort of dealing with these levels where you're trying to go from gene to gene expression, protein, and you can do this empirically, you can do this with models, but you're looking to see commonalities in terms of exposure across different species, across different chemicals, across classes of chemicals, in order to find sort of reproducible empirical effects. And then if you get that going, then maybe you can get a model that sort of honors some of those same processes. And that really holds a lot of appeal for a lot of reasons within the agency dealing with all these chemicals, and for ecological risk assessors in general having to deal with all these different species that are of concern. So I want to focus on FIFRA to talk about some specific models, in particular sort of how the Office of Pesticide Programs, Ecological Fate and Effects Division, where Andrew and Catherine are from, sort of estimate risks and decide this initial decision about whether to register pesticides or not, and then some of that information is carried forward in specific Endangered Species Act types of assessments for effects assessments. So it is a tiered process with different screening models that I'd never heard of before I came to the EPA. What's sort of unique about this process versus the circular process I'd gone through before is it actually goes through a science advisory panel. And so EFED, the program office, is all the time working in different technical teams to sort of come up with new models that are specific to dealing with ecological risk. But a lot of times they're dealing at this national scale. And when they have a model, as they sort of work through the literature, work through the available data, including data that's been submitted by different registrants with respect to certain pesticides, they can form a model, and that has to go through an external scientific panel, a scientific advisory panel, in order for that model to be approved for use. And what you end up with is sort of a complex problem in the sense that you have many different combinations of models. We'll look at 15 or 20 models that have been used for registration by OPP EFED. All the different species that we talked about, all the different chemicals, all the physical settings of all the possible ecosystems across the United States. Different control variables such as application rate that's on the label and different methods of application. And what you see if you look at maybe the past 20, 30 years of assessments within EFED is you also see an evolution of the technology, right? If you go back 20, 30 years ago, you have a lot of Fortran models that are the basis for mechanistic types of approaches for fate and transport. You go through a period of time where graphical user interfaces come into play, and so you see all these different ways to create a graphical user interface. The first time I'd ever seen a Fortran-based graphical user interface was with the EFED, if you can imagine such a thing. And what you have is a lot of different models that don't necessarily talk to each other. That's because they have different technological implementations. It can actually become time-consuming to do these different combinations because there's a lot of sneaker net type of stuff moving through different models. And I'll talk a little bit about our recent efforts to sort of take all these different models, put them into one platform so they're all speaking the same language and can communicate with each other by producing these as a web application, but also to sort of make it a little more transparent so that the models aren't so much, an inside type of work that's happening within EFED, but that it's more easier for the outside world to see what's going on, in particular other government agencies, other university researchers, master students looking for a topic to work on that sort of make it more transparent, some of these models and how they're being implemented. So when we first engaged with EFED, they sort of, and OCS and the whole office in general, they sort of gave us this master list of all the models that they use and make connections. In some cases, they're coupled or tripled, and to make connections based upon which receptor they're concerned about, what the exposure media was, what the type of release was. They had sort of built up this ecosystem of different models that they've used over 20, 30 years of implementing these registration types of processes. And I'll focus on a few of the ones that we've migrated over to this web application. A lot of times the focus is on the lower tiers, the sort of earlier screening types of tiers, but we've also brought along some Fortran types of models that do fate and transport for both groundwater and surface water types of issues, and looking at some aerial exposure types of applications. But here, what you have is a number of the models that are used to essentially screen for risks, in this case for different terrestrial exposure pathways with TerraPlant, which does plants, STIR, which does ingestion, drinking water ingestion and inhalation. Dust actually shouldn't be on this list. It's not approved yet. T-Rex and T-Herps is sort of looking at dietary exposures to different types of vertebrates. and then some ag drift and earthworm types of models. And you can see these dates. These are sort of the acceptance dates based upon Science Advisory Panel review. You can see how a lot of these are actually within the past 5 years. You're seeing a lot of increase in development of certain models and their acceptance by the Science Advisory Panel. On the aquatic modeling side, have more of the traditional fate and transport types of models, in particular the sort of the PRISM exams combination. These are Fortran models that does sort of standard aquatic exposure scenarios for a farm pond, for example, and then some more recent renovations of those models to allow for volume to change or to deal with rice paddies. And so these aquatic models can work together with the terrestrial models depending upon the type of exposure that's occurring, the type of application, what part of the country you're in. You might parameterize some of these differently. Some of these actually take active time series of rainfall and water flow and all that you have to pull from real locations. And so that's a big part of this assessment process in determining whether a pesticide, a certain label, can be registered or not. EFED, as I've mentioned, has developed a lot of models recently that have more in development now, so-called spatial aquatic model, which takes one of their screening models and allows it to apply to all different locations across the country. Downstream dilution model, I'll touch on these. Aldrey 3, which is the revised version of the plant model. Aldrey is the carnivore plant from Little Shop of Horrors, right? Terrestrial investigation model that allows for more detailed look at integration of different exposure pathways and accumulation of dose. And I'll talk a little bit about VerroPop, which is modifying a USDA-B model to take into account pesticide exposures. So this is a spatial aquatic model. Essentially, they're looking to apply their PRISM modeling at many, many locations across the country by pulling in actual time series data and actual NHD plus type of hydrology and landscape type of information. Requires a lot of input data, has to pretty serious computing capabilities, so we're kind of working with them to figure out how this is going to be done. But they have done a pilot that is able to sort of assess these risks around the Ohio River Valley by looking at running this model in multiple locations. Rather than just trying to find one location or a couple locations that are representative of all types of exposures, just go ahead and run it at all these different situations. In particular, to sort of interface with Endangered Species Act type of issues to better identify certain areas where there may be more of an overlap with known ranges of endangered species. In addition, there's a downstream dilution model, which allows you to sort of look how far downstream from a site a pesticide is traveling and be able to estimate exposure concentrations at different distances downstream. A pretty straightforward approach, but a capability that they very much want to have. And then Andrew Konarek and Chris Garber have been working with the USDA, Gloria DeGrande Hoffman, and Bob Curry, their model developer, to essentially take advantage of their structured population model that they have, that they use to assess sort of varroa mite risks to colonies, and layer on a pesticide component for neonics to look at the toxicokinetics, the toxicodynamics of those exposure situations, what's going on in these different bee colonies, and to sort of improve the screening process for pesticides on the front end to also take into account risks to pollinators. And in addition, there's a EPA-funded program with Ohio State, which we hope to be able to collect some data to help parameterize this model, because there's a lot of uncertainties about certain parameters that are in play with this approach, and a lot of sort of ongoing discussions about how to do that. So that's on the EFED side. A couple of us here work for the Office of Research and Development, and so there's a CSS program, Chemicals for Safe Sustainability, something like that, that has an ecological modeling task. So there's lots of research issues that are targeted at ecological modeling in general. And there's also this dashboard task that I'll talk about But essentially what's going on here is if you look at the different breakouts, both in terms of internal dose, ecological effects, external dose, and the different case studies, they're sort of elaborations on this idea that we're looking to take this individual level assessment and go down into the subcellular level or go up to populations, communities to sort of understand what risks might be and how best to get there, especially given the restrictions that the EPA has in terms of the data submittal requirements. What data does OPP have when they do a particular assessment, and how can we use that information to leverage a population model, that sort of thing. And so there's a few models from the ORD side that are of interest. WebICE, which is doing all the extrapolation that Valerie was talking about to essentially extrapolate from many species to many species, dependent upon known toxicity information, known effects data, and other characteristics of the target species and the surrogate species that you're interested in. A few different models. Leslie model with logistic dose done by the Narragansett folks to look at mercury exposures in loons, expressed as a web application, so you can run that. We've also done some of the Hansen and Stark type of logistic and probit dose models as web applications themselves. These are available on what's known as the Untertool, untertool.appspot.com. These are just sort of developing models for general consideration that might one day be used for OPP purposes or other purposes. We also have McNest by Matthew Ederson. Matthew, I swear that was a capital C. I had a capital M, capital C. And so this is essentially a Monte Carlo assessment that looks at nesting success and fledgling survival due to exposures and pesticides, and developed by Matthew in a very specific way to account for the type of data that the EPA, that the office receives from different registrants. And this is part of one of the case studies within the ORD Ecological Modeling Program to transfer this model to the actual registration process that's being done by OPP. Then also HexSim, developed by Nathan Shoemaker out in Corvallis. This is more of a development environment for being spatially explicit and setting up different scenarios. Can do chemical exposure, can also do disease, can do a lot of different things by taking into account spatial variability of habitat quality, of contaminant exposure, and movement of individuals on a landscape. And this has also been applied a couple times to endangered species type of situations like the San Joaquin kit fox. What you also see within the agency is a heavy emphasis on getting data out, right? Getting data out as web services so that other people can use it. And there's a lot of these data products that have been developed that are essentially accessible as web pages. WebICE is doing that, but EnviroFacts, Ecotox, TalkCastDB, Sequapass, all of these are efforts to sort of take specific data and serve them up within the EPA, but also to the outside world to sort of make them more useful. And what this allows is sort of the construction of a confederation of web services, a lot of different servers that are serving up all sorts of data, and so you can sort of have these clearinghouses to be able to access lots of information. What we've also been working on with eFed is to essentially do this with a lot of their models, that we can take their models and also express them as different web services. And this has a lot of advantages. For one thing, we can sort of construct our own front end so anybody can come in, whether inside the EPA or outside the EPA, and leverage these different models, use them in ways as they're intended or in research types of applications. It's a GitHub type of project so that we have multiple people that are contributing code to this project. And it's occurring within the EPA. And we've been kind of forced down this road because of how all the different models within eFed are constructed. That some are Fortran models, some are actually Excel spreadsheets, others are more visual basic types of implementation. So we've been struggling with sort of how we get all these in a coherent type of model application. And so what we've done is we end up going to the web using different servers to serve up different models that are dependent upon different technology platforms, and allow them to communicate to each other using what's known as REST services, the way that machines on the internet talk to each other. What I was kind of slow to realize is, we were, heavy into all the details of this to allow us to sort of connect these models. But this is sort of a broader way for the entire community to sort of have communication of models in data. So it's not just limited to our particular implementation within the EPA. Anybody that's putting their models and their data out there as web services can then call other models, call other data, and sort of construct, again, a confederation, a sort of larger scale integration of all these different models that are important for ecological risk assessment. And it's a hybrid. This might be the worst PowerPoint I've ever made. So it's a hybrid cloud type of environment. And what you have here, it's not even finished. This is sort of the EPA sort of inside the firewall. And so this is one of our big problems, is that we're inside the firewall. We can't get out for a lot of reasons. But there's a big emphasis on cloud computing nowadays. We're very close to having what's known as a hybrid cloud type of environment, where we sort of have this firewall between this hybrid cloud and our EPA internal network, so that we can take care of sort of data secure situations, both in this hybrid cloud and within the EPA firewall. But in this hybrid cloud, you can also sort of punch out to the outside, pull in web services from other sources, including other data and other models, and serve up these front-end interfaces that run these different models. And so what this allows for is for this larger confederation of ecological risk models and ecological risk data that can talk to each other. It's in an authenticated way. You can't just randomly call it, because you got to worry about hackers and all that. But you can sort of build these secure connections between different organizations across federal agencies, across the pond, all that kind of stuff, and allow for these models to talk to each other. And people can sort of independently build their own front-end user interfaces as they need in order to run these models and create their own front end. It can be a PC installed program, or it can be a web application. So this is what our web application looks like currently. We have a lot of these eFed models down the left. This is available at www.ubertool.org. At the moment, we're looking to move it inside the agency to an EPA.gov subdomain. And then each one of these models has these different tabs. Has a description tab that sort of lays out what the model does, has an input tab where you would parameterize the model, an algorithm tab which explains what the model is doing, references that has links to, for example, past assessments where that particular model was used in a submitted assessment by the EPA. We have this sort of on-demand QA/QC, so you can check and make sure that the model is working correctly. And you can also batch model run. So if you have 100 different label uses, you can send all 100 of them at once as one sort of input file. Or if you want to do a Monte Carlo analysis, you can send 5,000 different sets of randomization of the parameters to essentially construct a Monte Carlo analysis on your own. And kind of real usefully from the EPA's perspective, we also have this history tab, which means that if you choose to, you can essentially record your result and then come back to it later and sort of figure out what did you do in that assessment you did last year or last week or last night or whatever, that you can sort of persistently save all these model runs and pull out the input parameters that you used and the output parameters that you used. Another nice thing from this perspective is that it kind of puts the model, since these are models the EPA uses, it has to go through an approval process. If something changes, when you push the changes, when you put this new model on the server, then all of a sudden everybody's using the new model. It's not a situation where somebody has to go out, re-download the model to rerun it, that sort of thing. That all these models are sort of instantly updated when you deploy them to a web server. Okay, so for us, it's a lot of all this is about the basic types of ecological risk research. How do you get that to development? How do you get that to influence decision making at the EPA, at other agencies? This particular application is all about registration or re-registration or labeling types of processes. It's also about increasing the availability, the use of the models, the transparency of the whole process. And you're sitting on supercomputers to a certain extent, high-performance computers, so you can have all the computational power that you want to pay for. People think of web models as being dinky little things, but these are actually front-ending very computationally intensive programs as appropriate. And to be quite honest, it's not that bad to do. It's all these sort of development processes sort of get easier over the years. And so with a particular setup, it doesn't take us that long to spin up a new model because we're reusing a lot of the code for the front end. We're reusing available servers that are already constructed, and we're reusing middleware that we're familiar with. So there's not really a shortage of available models that can be helpful for the EPA. It does take a while to work through the process of incorporating specific models. A lot of times it runs into these scale issues. But there's big advantages to these web services. We can leverage other services, other people's data sets, other people's models, and people will be able to reuse ours. And what we're essentially doing is creating a programming interface, an API for pesticide registration that sort of accommodates all these big parts of the pesticide registration process. And it becomes, I don't know if you're familiar with all these cloud terms like software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service, but it becomes essentially a science as a service type of application so that people can run these models both inside and outside the agency. And to touch on some of the issues that were discussed earlier, again, this interoperability in terms of building, really building systems models that try to reach from molecular to populations or communities, you really do sort of encounter different types of implementations, different operating systems, different programming languages, different user interface dependencies, and usually that breaks down somewhere along the way. But in this sort of web services arena, so if I go back to my terrible figure, all these different servers are actually running different types of operating systems or having different purposes. You have some database servers. You can have a Linux server that's running the Fortran models. You can have another server that's running the Python, the more recently developed Python modules. You can have another server that's the front-end application that's serving as a user interface to the world. There's lots of scalability here, lots of, and it's much cheaper than trying to develop on your own servers. So there's a lot of advantages to this type of approach. And I think it's important to consider what Valerie said earlier about sort of this Lodek et al. Paper as an example, that these sort of false negatives that you see in these lower tiers, these are huge problems, right? These are situations where they end up causing big problems down the road because they get approved, yet they weren't adequately caught in the screening model that was applied. And so even for these lower tier type of models, I think it's very useful to have it out there for different people who are collecting data to be able to test on their own, to help with model selection, to help with model parameterization, essentially because the overall goal here is to sort of minimize these false negative and false positive ecological risk assessment driven decision errors. And I think that's all I got.